happy to see this large turnout. My name is Professor Edward Castillo, and I am the chairman of the Native American Studies Department and the American Multicultural Studies Department. I'm happy to be here to introduce to you an old friend and colleague that has been brought here by the Associated Students, the Intercultural Center, and especially want to thank Bruce Berkowitz for making all this possible. Wilma Mankiller was at San Francisco State when the first Native American Studies program had been developed in the nation. I was at that time at UC Riverside and quickly went to UCLA and then to UC Berkeley to be part of that as well. Wilma was a leader among the San Francisco Bay Area Indians. She served as 10 years as the principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. She has devoted her life to supporting her people, helping Indian youth. She's received 18 honorary doctorate degrees. She was a fellow at Dartmouth and has presented over 100 lectures at universities and more than a dozen papers in journals and newspapers. She is a trustee of the Ford Foundation and the Freedom Forum. She has co-authored Mankiller, a chief of her people, St. Martin's Press, and has recently completed a book, interviews of indigenous women, titled Every Day is a Good Day. She is one of a handful of Native Americans who has received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. On a personal note, Wilma and I met up on Alcatraz in 1969 during the occupation. But she has more to say about that and other things, and please give her a warm applause.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I just want to say thank you to Ed for the introduction. And Ed and I knew each other when we were both very young, and Ed was a very articulate spokesperson for California Indians. At that time, there were a lot of out-of-state Native people who were speaking for tribal people in this state. And Ed always reminded people that there were people indigenous to this state who had something to say and who wanted to tell their own stories. And always appreciated that, and in all these years I remembered that about him. And so I appreciate his work too. What I wanted to, the topic of my discussion tonight is context is everything. And I believe it is when you think about Native American issues or the issues that we deal with today. And the idea of context of everything basically grew out of my belief that even after hundreds of years of living in our former towns and villages, too few Americans know much about our history, culture, or contemporary lives and issues. And it's my belief that it's almost impossible to understand the challenges tribal people face in the 21st century without placing those issues in a cultural and a historical context. So let me begin with some very basic information about tribal governments. There are over 550 very distinct tribal governments in the United States, each with their own history, culture, and language. The structure of tribal governments and the manner in which leaders are selected differs from nation to nation. The Cherokee and Navajo, the two tribes with the largest populations in North America, select their leaders by popular election. In Onondaga territory, the women select their leaders, and the women install their leaders in a very elaborate ceremony, and only the women can remove their leaders. In some tribal nations, the council or legislative body is elected at large, and then the elected council selects their top leadership. And in some of the pueblos in New Mexico, gifted spiritual leaders select their top leaders. Therefore, if there were a dozen leaders of tribal nations here on the stage with me tonight, They may all hold similar positions, but the manner in which they were selected or elected may be quite different. The land base and population of tribal governments range from those who control millions of acres of land to some with less than 25 acres of land. I remember when I lived in Northern California, we frequently visited the Kashaya Rancheria, which is a very tiny piece of land, but it had the attributes of sovereignty. And some tribes, as I said before, have very large memberships, and some have very small memberships. There are some tribal governments in California with less than 100 enrolled members at this point. I think it's very important to note that the population of a tribal nation or the land base of a tribal nation does not determine the degree to which it enjoys sovereignty and the right to self-governance. Just as the tiny principality of Monaco enjoys some of the same international rights as China and the United States, tribal governments with a tiny land base and small population are sovereign entities with the same powers as tribes with a large population or land base. Tribal governments today in the 21st century enjoy and exercise a range of sovereign rights. Some tribal governments, such as the Onondaga, continue their original form of tribal government that they've had since the beginning of time, and they even issue their own passports, which are recognized for international travel, while other tribal governments must fight for federal recognition after centuries of outrageous exploitation. Native Hawaiians in particular are waging an inspiring battle to retain rights to some of the most coveted land in the Western Hemisphere. Though a few tribal governments are structured according to ancient traditions, others are either an adaptation of the traditional government, or in some cases, governments are organized under recently adopted constitutions. For example, the current system of governance in the Cherokee Nation bears little resemblance to traditional Cherokee governance, which was a series of self-governing, semi-autonomous villages and towns. During the time when Cherokee villages enjoyed great autonomy, leaders of all the Cherokee people were necessarily only in times of catastrophe or when the people had to defend themselves against an external threat. No single leader had the unilateral authority of a present-day Cherokee principal chief. I've been asked, why do tribal governments exist within the U.S., one of the most powerful governments in the world? The person asking that question simply did not realize that tribal people lived in organized societies for centuries before the United States came into being. Well before the first U.S. colony was established, the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois, developed the Iroquois Confederacy, a United Nations, for the purpose of peace, trade, and friendship, an institution that remains in existence today. When the United States was in its infancy, it recognized tribal sovereignty in formal treaties with tribal nations. Between 1779 and 1871, when the formal treaty-making era ended, the U.S. executed and the Senate ratified more than 370 formal treaties with Native nations. Though treaties were and are recognized as valid legal instruments and statements of federal policy, they've rarely been honored by the United States. The treaty agreements often involved the United States government taking tribal land. According to the First Nations Development Institute, by the early 18th century, the U.S. took more than 2 billion acres by treaty or official government confiscation. Many federal land policies further reduced tribal land holdings, and a number of late 19th and early 20th century congressional acts set the stage for breaking up tribal lands which had always been held in common into individual allotments. In the early 20th century, Cherokee people in Indian Territory, what's now Oklahoma, were devastated when they were forced to individually allot their commonly held tribal lands. Individual allotment of tribal lands had a profound impact on the culture, economy, and lifeways of Cherokee people. Though land was and remains critical to the cultural survival of tribal people and their governments, tribal governments now control only a tiny fraction of their original landholdings. The dozens of anti-sovereignty groups who argue that tribal people should not have, quote, special rights, unquote, fail to understand that tribal people gave up billions of acres of land and sacrificed millions of lives to retain our rights to self-governance. Despite these losses, tribal governments continue to exist and in many cases to thrive. I believe that one underlying reason for the tenacity of Native people is the key role women have played in tribal life. Most Americans know very little about Native women except for a few almost mythical icons such as Sacagawea, an intelligent, resourceful Shoshone interpreter for Lewis and Clark's early 19th century expedition. This appalling lack of accurate information about Native women fuels negative stereotypes. Television, film, and print media often portray Native women as asexual drudges or innocent children of nature, while real thin white women are held up as idealized representations of womanhood. In the media, as in the larger society, the power, strength, and complexity of Native women is rarely acknowledged or recognized. While the role of Native women in the family and community, now and in the past, differs from nation to nation, women have played very significant roles in tribal society. Navajo women once controlled the economy of the Navajo Nation by owning and managing the livestock. And Ojibwe women trapped small animals, dressed furs, and built canoes. Prior to Cherokee removal, our women were consulted in matters of importance to the community, the clan, the family, and the nation. When a Cherokee man married a woman, he took up residence with the clan of his wife. Cherokee people traced their clan ancestry, their very identity, through women. There was once a women's council composed of each of the 7 Cherokee clans. Female warriors, women who made a decision to go off to war with men, that were called war women or pretty women, and were considered tribal dignitaries. A woman's power was considered so great that special women were able to declare whether punishment was to be inflicted upon those who had committed offenses against the people or they were to be pardoned. Now, once again, women are assuming leadership roles in their governments and communities at a time when the strong voices of both women and men are needed in the battle to protect tribal sovereignty and treaty rights. This battle is made immeasurably more difficult by the fact that so few members of Congress or their constituents across the U.S. know much about either the history or contemporary lives of Native people. When complicated tribal land, water rights, taxation, and jurisdiction issues are debated in the Congress or chronicled in media reports, it's difficult for people without any kind of historical context to understand these issues. Many people who hear about present-day issues and controversies between state and tribal governments are completely unaware of the long history of government-to-government relations between tribal governments and the United States government. Comanche leader LaDonna Harris says some people view tribal governments as, quote, play, unquote, governments because they learn nothing about them in high school or in political science classes. And she goes on to say, we have kept our cultural and political autonomy, and few people understand that. To me, it's really pretty amazing how little many Americans have learned about the original inhabitants of this land now called America. Yet over time, Native people have had to learn everything about the larger society around us as we read their literature, watch their films, worship in their churches, and attend their educational institutions. Every third-grade student in the U.S. is presented with the concept of Europeans discovering a, quote, new world, unquote. Only the most enlightened teacher will explain that this world was certainly not new to the millions of people who lived on this land for thousands of years before Europeans arrived. The lack of accurate information about Native people leaves a void, which is often filled with stereotypes that sometimes romanticize Native people and sometimes vilify Native people. And I think a few misinformed people apparently believe tribal people still live and dress as they did 300 years ago. During my tenure as principal chief of the Cherokee Nation, every summer, tourists would visit Tahlequah, the capital of the Cherokee Nation. And I think they expected to see tribal people on Main Street dressed in buckskins and living in teepees. Because invariably, one of the tourists would stop by my office and say, "Where are all the Indians?" And when a crestfallen tourist would ask that, I sometimes responded quite truthfully, "They're probably at Kmart." And there's a new stereotype of the wealthy casino Indian that's emerging now. Though very few tribally owned casinos enjoy enormous financial success, and even fewer make per capita payments to their citizens, a great deal of media attention has been focused on the wealthy tribes who distribute some of their casino revenue to tribal members through per capita payments. The Indian casinos have created a great deal of debate within and without tribal communities, but those debates really aren't that dissimilar to the debates that occur in the larger society when state governments develop lotteries or approve the development of riverboat gambling operations to fund basic services. Let me talk about a couple of the issues that I think that are universal. I talked about the differences between tribal communities and tribal governments, but there are also some commonalities. And I think one of the things that's a universal priority for all tribal governments, I think it's safe to say, is the protection of tribal governments and the upholding of tribal treaty rights. And then what's really been interesting to me for the past, I'd say, 25 years, is that among tribal governments, no matter whether they're small or large or whether they're struggling or have a lot of wealth, is the concern about what one elder described as the traditional ways slipping away. I think there's almost universal concern about tribal traditional knowledge systems and culture being lost. And so I think a priority for tribal governments at this point and tribal people is the development of practical projects that are designed to maintain traditional knowledge systems and the culture and the language. By system, I mean that some people only concentrate on the language, preserving the language, or they only concentrate on preserving a discrete ceremony. And I think that it's important to maintain the entire system of knowledge and not just a discrete aspect of the knowledge. If you talk to every tribal person in this room, they probably would have a different idea of what constitutes tribal culture and what's the priority. Some people would say medicine. It's most important to maintain the medicine. Other people would say it is the language. Other people would say it was ceremony. Other people would say that it's a relationship to the land. But I believe that one of the most important challenges of our time is to find ways to preserve that knowledge. When we lose a traditional elder, because so much of our information and knowledge is passed down from generation to generation through the oral tradition and is not recorded in any other way, when we use a traditional tribal elder, we lose thousands of years of unique knowledge that was passed down from generation to generation. A lot of our history is told through stories. A lot of our stories give us a sense of continuity and help us understand and know our place in the world. One of the common characteristics of culture that I think that most people would believe would agree on from community to community is the importance, or what they see even in the most troubled tribal community, is the importance of maintaining a sense of interdependence, a sense of responsibility for one another. And because we live in tribal societies, we have tribal governments, we still live in a way that's very, very interdependent, and we have a sense of responsibility for one another. I always feel very fortunate that I was born Cherokee and that my life has evolved in a set of reciprocal relationships. I'm responsible, and I know I'm responsible for others in my community, and they're responsible for me. Reciprocity and living according to a certain set of values, to me, is one of the most important attributes of tribal culture. While it's not possible for all tribal people to speak their own native language or participate in their own tribal set of seasonal ceremonies, traditional values can be maintained by anyone, even if one lives in an urban area. And so the value of interdependence with one another and interdependence with the land, I think is an important cultural attribute. I recently had the privilege of meeting a number of young Native people, Dawson, her mini horses, and a number of other people who work on for Wall Street firms, but they've managed to retain their ties to their homelands and people, as well as a strong sense of tribal identity and values, even when working in the very competitive financial services industry. At home, in Cherokee country, in eastern Oklahoma, traditional values is not just a word, it plays itself out in the way people live their lives and work. Traditional Cherokee values are evident in a very widespread self-help housing movement where people help band together, families band together and help build each other's houses. And people often characterize this self-help movement, which has been going on for about 25 years, as they return to the time when Cherokee people were responsible for one another and help one another. Recently, I asked one of our respected elders, Leroy Backwater, what it means to be a good Cherokee, and to which he replied, a good Cherokee person is respectful to others, respects oneself, always, always, always keeps his or her word, and helps other people. And so I think it's the values, the old values that are very important. Before Cherokees were forcibly removed to Indian Territory, what is now Oklahoma, in the late 1800s, every year we had a ceremony in every one of the settlements that I talked about. And the purpose of that ceremony was to rekindle relationships and to request forgiveness for inappropriate conduct during the previous year, and also to cleanse the mind of negative thoughts. Having a good, clean mind, a good, clear mind, is a very important Cherokee value. Everybody who participated in this ceremony, which was a very public ceremony, was forgiven for past offenses, and once participants left that ceremony, they could never again speak of the offense that they were forgiven for. They spoke about it, and they went through the ceremony, and then they could never speak about it again. It was erased. Therefore, nobody left the ceremony with grudges or animosity toward one another. As a part of that ceremony, a symbolic but very important feature of the ceremony was that each family, each house in the village, put out their home fire at their home and relit their home fire from a central ceremonial fire, again as a symbol of unity. A very high premium was placed on community and restoring harmony and balance in the community and encouraging people to have a good, clean mind. In the self-help movement that is described, and also in the traditional, the prayers of traditional Cherokee medicine people, you can still see elements of this idea of keeping a good mind. One of our elders, Crosland Smith, always starts a Cherokee meeting, by saying, first let us remove all negative thoughts from our mind so we can come together as one. That's an old Cherokee way of saying, take the busyness out of your mind. Stop thinking about somebody in the room you may have had a grievance against or some problem that you're worrying about. Instead, clean your mind and have a good, clear mind so we can focus on the task at hand, whatever the task might be. And so we still see that in our communities. And also that's part of a system of thinking that's had a huge impact on me. And that is to the goal of this prayer and the goal of a lot of ceremonies was to promote a sense of oneness and unity. And there's a belief that an underlying belief that if you have, as a human being, if you have thousands of negative or hateful or revengeful or jealous thoughts and you leave them unchecked, you allow these thoughts to roam around through your mind unchecked, that they eventually will permeate your being and will ultimately result in negative action or even violent action. So that the belief is that you have to battle these negative thoughts in your mind and keep them out of your mind, and which has had a huge impact on me. I believe that one of the reasons that I was elected for 3 4-year terms in a very competitive races is because I'm positive, and because no matter what situation I find myself in, I manage to find something positive to focus on. So that in a room full of people who are saying, oh, we tried that 20 years ago and that didn't work, or we can't do that because we don't have money, or we can't do that because we don't know how. I was always the person who was standing up and saying, yeah, but why don't we try this? Or yeah, but why don't we try that? So I think this idea of having a clear, positive mind was in large part the reason why I got elected. And if you ask people at home about me, not people who read things about me in a magazine or paper or something like that, but people who know me, and what they'll say about me is that I'm a positive person. And what I'm talking about goes well beyond the power of positive thinking. I'm talking about keeping a good mind as a discipline. And in my most recent book, Every Day is a Good Book, Every Day is a Good Day, the reason I interviewed the women for that book is that I believe that belief has sustained tribal people in a lot of different tribes, not just my tribe. That people go to ceremony and they pray to be good people and to have a good mind, and they pray to be able to see a way forward and to show the children a way forward. And so that, I think, is a very important attribute of leadership. And in my personal life, I've had cancer twice. I've had 2 kidney transplants, and when I was in graduate school, I had a very terrible accident for which I still wear a brace. And through all that, I kept moving forward. And I learned something very important about each and every one of those incidents. I learned something about myself, and I learned something about the people around me. And so I found a gift out of each of those experiences, in large part because of what I learned from my own family and my own community about keeping a good mind. And I think for people who are outside our communities, who drive by and they see dilapidated housing or poverty or internal struggles or that sort of thing, what they see is they see all the problems and challenges we face, but they don't ever see that it's balanced for those of us who live in tribal communities. It's balanced by this sense of community. It's balanced by this willingness to try to see something positive about what's going on. It's balanced by the ceremonies. It's balanced by our sense of community. And so we know about all the problems in our communities. We live with them every day. But because we live inside the communities, we have a little different view than the people outside the communities. Appearances can be very capricious when you're thinking about Native people. And one of the other things, I think, is that sometimes people look at tribal people, and particularly tradition-oriented tribal people, and they think that because we dress like everybody else around them, because we drive similar cars, and because we live in similar houses, that we think like them, or that we have the same values. And that's not necessarily true. I think you can go to a big powwow today, and you can see young people walking around with iPods and cell phones, and their parents and grandparents probably get their news from CNN, but they filter the information they receive. Often, tradition-oriented people filter their information they receive through tribal values and a tribal way of thinking. I remember a story LaDonna Harris told me. She was the wife of a United States senator. She's Comanche. And Oklahoma Senator Fred Harris, who ran for president as well. And she said, I hate it when Native people say we live in 2 worlds. I never lived in 2 worlds. I'm Comanche. I'm Comanche no matter where I go. And she said, sometimes my husband and I would be meeting with the President of the United States or even the King of Sweden. And she said, I may dress just like the other Senate wives, but when we had a conversation, I filtered what I heard through my Comanche values. and I filtered it through my Comanche way of thinking. So I think that if there's just one thing that you understand about tribal culture, and particularly among more traditional people, it's that just because people look similar and dress similar and live in similar houses doesn't necessarily mean that they view the world in the same way. So we have this concern about tribal culture slipping away. But the good news is that a lot of communities and tribal communities have initiated very aggressive projects to preserve tribal language and culture and heritage. The Blackfeet in Montana have started a number of highly successful language immersion programs in schools. The Onondaga School, which is a public school, teaches tribal history and language. The Hopi Foundation works to protect ancient structures, and the Cherokee language is taught in Head Start programs, and history and language is taught in many communities and even now on the internet. And there are many encouraging signs that tribal governments are preparing their citizens for the future. Many tribal governments are using the revenue generated from successful gaming enterprises to develop impressive health and education programs. Others are providing financial literacy programs for tribal members and establishing partnerships with the community. More and more, what I've seen in my lifetime is that tribal people are trusting their own thinking again and looking within their own communities for solutions to entrenched problems. Tribal communities and governments are certifying their own foster homes, handling their own adoptions, negotiating their own water rights settlements and leases and taking charge of their future. Native journalists, professors, filmmakers, museum curators, historians, and secondary school educators are changing the public perception of Native people. I'm often asked why I remain optimistic about the future of Native nations and Native people, given the daunting set of problems and challenges they face every day. And my response to that question is, as always, to see our future, you need only look back to our past. We as a people have endured war, mass removal, loss of life, land, resources, and rights, and a wholesale attempt by the United States government to assimilate us. But here we are in the 21st century, we're still standing. And we continue to have strong, viable Native communities. If we've managed to hold on to a robust sense of who we are, despite the staggering amount of adversity we've faced, how can we not be optimistic about the future? After every major tribal upheaval, we've almost had to reinvent ourselves as a people, but we've never, ever given up our sense of family, of community, of clan, of nation. If we've endured all that, we're prepared for whatever the Creator may send our way in the future. And my guess is that we'll still have viable tribal communities 100 years from now, 200 years from now, and 500 years from now. So on this beautiful spring evening, which is a time of seasonal change and renewal, despite all the problems and issues we have, we still can rejoice in the knowledge that the ceremonies given to us by the Creator continue. The original languages are still spoken, and many of our governments remain strong. As a people, we acknowledge the hardships of the past without dwelling on them. Instead, we look to the future with the same faith that has kept us together thus far. The Mohawks speak for all of us when they recite my favorite proverb. It's hard to see the future with tears in your eyes. And I always add, or with anger in your heart. We acknowledge the past, but we can't go around with anger in our heart and get anything done. And we can't wring our hands and cry about our current situation and figure out a way to move forward and help clear a path for the children. I always feel that one of the responsibilities of adults and is to help young people and children see a way forward. And we can't do that with anger in our heart or tears in our eyes. So I love that proverb. It's hard to see the future with tears in your eyes. So let me leave you with that proverb, and I'll take some questions and also say that I hope my being here with you today at Sonoma State University will help to erase any stereotypes you might have about what a chief looks like. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I have a very severe hearing problem, so somebody's going to have to come back up and repeat questions for me. Somebody want to do that? Okay. While he's coming up, somebody earlier asked me about my name, which is kind of unusual. And so I'll tell you about my name. And I'll first tell you a story. When I was in office, I went to do a lecture at a very prestigious Eastern college that I won't name. So I arrive at the airport, and this young man comes to meet me at the gate in the days when they could still meet you at the gate. And so we're walking down to baggage claim, and he says, "So, since principal chief is a male term, how should I address you?" So we just keep walking. I didn't answer him. So he said, "How about if we address you as chieftainess?" And so there's this stereotype that data people are stoic. So I thought, I'm just going to be stoic and not answer this guy. And so we go on to get my baggage. It got worse. He had other suggestions. So we get out to the campus. We go through our presentation on economic development. And then the same young man asked me about the origin of my name. And so he says, "Ms. Mankiller, what's the origin of your name?" And I said, "It's a nickname, and I earned it." And let him sit there and think about that. Let him sit there and think about that for a while and kind of mull that over. And but the truth is that in the semi-autonomous villages that I spoke about earlier, there was a person who watched over the village who was kind of like a warrior. And when you translate, the title was Mankiller. It wasn't literally Mankiller, but when you translate it into English, that's the closest translation is Mankiller. And so the ancestor we trace back to the mid-1700s, signed up for a census roll when the United States government started taking census rolls of Cherokee people, and he used his title as his name. And that's who we trace our ancestry back to. That's the story of my name. So somebody had a question over here. Yeah, it was I heard that one. That was a very wonderful time. We were relocated to San Francisco by the Bureau of Indian Affairs under a program that took tribal families that lived on tribal land to urban areas. The idea was to mainstream us into the larger society, and they promised my dad a better life. We had 11 children in our family. We were farmers, and there just wasn't enough really to go around. So they promised my dad this better life for us. And so we ended up in San Francisco in a very rough housing project called Hunters Point. And that was our better life. And my dad ended up in a back-breaking job at a rope factory in San Francisco. And so for someone who lived in a rural area like us, we had lived in an area, I still live in the same place, but it's changed. But we had no paved road near our house. We had very little contact with the outside world. We had no electricity, no indoor plumbing. And to get on a train and then a few days later end up in San Francisco was like landing on the moon. So that's how we got here. And so I grew up in the Bay Area during a time of great change. You could hear Jimi Hendrix playing at the Fillmore West. You could probably hear Janis Joplin playing in a public park. The music was changing. There were middle-class young people going to Haight-Ashbury. There's huge civil rights demonstrations all over the United States, which we were very interested in because we were living in a primarily African-American community. There was a Red Power movement, the Brown Beret movement, the beginning of the contemporary women's rights movement, lots of meetings. And within the context of all that, some students from San Francisco State occupied Alcatraz Island, so we got involved in all that. So when I think about my time in the Bay Area, it's both good and bad. The bad part was the wrenching decision my family made to leave home and come to the Bay Area, and then we all ended up back home. And then the good part was being able to be here and be able to witness so many social changes. This huge free speech movement at Berkeley. People started People's Park, massive anti-war movement, and all that helped prepare me for leadership. I remember being going by the Armory at 14th and Mission Street in San Francisco and seeing a young man protesting against the war and being beat up. Very young white boy, maybe 17 or 18 years old, being beat up just for he wasn't yelling or anything like that, and it had a profound impact on me. So when I got in a leadership position, we would give coffee to people who protested one of our policies because it made me strongly believe in the right of people to express themselves and have freedom of speech. So my time in the Bay Area, I think, was an incredibly wonderful time. I also did volunteer work for the Pitt River Tribe for 4 years, and was very involved with, very involved with California Indian rights. I just inherently knew, even as a young woman, that the stories of the California Indian people were very important stories to be heard. And so I read a lot about California Indian history and traveled around to a lot of the communities and gathered seaweed from along the ocean in ancient pomo baskets with some of the pomo women, and just have a lot of rich and wonderful memories of Northern California. Drank the wonderful wine from this area, and I have a lot of wonderful memories from this area. Okay, great.
When you were young, when we were young.
That's great.
But I want to know, are you going to Red Earth in January? I mean, in June? In Oklahoma?
We go sometimes. We went last year.
I'm going this year, and I missed last year.
You missed last year? I probably will go. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Alrighty. Okay. It's changed a lot. When I first ran for election, which is now more than 20 years ago, there were, of the more than 550 federally recognized tribes, there were probably maybe 79 or 80 women in tribal leadership positions. I was the first woman to lead my tribe, but there were many women who led other tribes well before I came on the scene. And now, there's at least double that amount. I can't remember the exact figure, but there are a very significant number of tribal women in leadership positions. There are several factors, I think, that influence that. One is that a lot of tribal governments have assumed greater control over running their own hospitals and clinics and providing their own services, and a lot of tribal administrative positions are held by women. So that serves as a pipeline to elected tribal leadership positions. Another factor, which is not so positive, is that more tribal women are graduating from college than are tribal men, by far. The last study I looked at was for the academic year 2002-2003, and a significantly greater number of tribal women were graduating with bachelor's degrees than with men. So I think both those things are factors. And to another extent, I think that as tribes begin to look into their tribal traditional ways and their tribal history, they realize that things are out of balance when there are only men in control. and to try to restore the balance that we need to hear the voices of both men and women in tribal government. So I think all those things are a factor in more women assuming tribal leadership positions. Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to add a comment. I did a paper once on Indian women who led revolts against the missions in the Borderlands area. And a student came up to me and asked me at the end, he said, I thought Indian women were enslaved by their husbands. And I looked at him and I said, you've obviously never been married to an American Indian woman.
That's true.
The movements that are starting to happen where generally white culture is trying to learn more about native spiritual traditions like Carlos Castaneda and stuff like that.
New Age stuff about Carlos Castaneda and the whites who are trying to emulate Native American traditions.
I think it's very difficult because what happens with most of the New Age people, the non-Native people who are trying to appropriate Native American culture, is that they're interested in one aspect of the culture, or a discrete ceremony, but they don't have the history or the context or the base of knowledge to make the ceremony even meaningful or valuable. And so when I lived in California, they were doing sun dances in Sacramento, for goodness sakes. And the deep spiritual aspects of a sun dance couldn't occur in a place like that without the cultural and historical context and without being done properly. There's a great deal of protocol to all tribal ceremonies. I remember when we went to Kashaya, there was a woman there named Essie Parrish. And they had a strawberry festival there, and then they had ceremonies in this roundhouse, and they danced in this roundhouse. But there was great protocol to being able to participate in the things in the roundhouse. So no matter where I've gone, I've found that you have to have a base of knowledge in order to make these things work. So I think that a lot of Native people are concerned because they see some people are well-meaning people who are just who are longing for spirituality, and they're just trying to find something to make their lives whole. But in the process of doing that, I think that they're actually hurting Native people by appropriating and, or I should say, misappropriating tribal culture, or what they think is tribal culture, and then changing it into something that has no value whatsoever.
Where two Cherokee women wanted to marry one another. And there was a controversy about that. And ultimately, it went to the Cherokee Supreme Court, who ruled that that was contrary to Cherokee traditional law. So I'm wondering two things. One is what has happened since then with respect to this case. And I'm also wondering if this has occurred during His Majesty's Kingdom's principal chief, how she would have been.
Okay. When the case played itself out, the two women who went to the court, and the last time they went to the court, the most recent decision, and the decision still standing, said that they could marry. And so that's the last decision. And I know that there were several decisions before that. When I was in office, I didn't marry anybody. I didn't think we ought to be in the business of marrying, and and it didn't matter who it was. And that was my position, and I just didn't see that there were a lot of other activities that had been conducted in traditional times that a principal chief was responsible for conducting, but we're more like a corporate, government now, and so I just didn't see that. So I just refused to do that. So that's probably what I would still do, just sort of a common sense. We're not in that business. And but the most recent ruling said they could get a license to marry. And so, and that's the decision that's still standing.
tonight. I'm wondering if you might have a message that I could bring back to her and the Youth Council.
I think the most important thing that I've learned is that that I wish I knew when I was a teenager is that education is really important, and in terms of a public school and reading widely and learning as much as you can about the world with an open mind. But I think that for young people, I think that the happiest people I've seen, the most fulfilled people I've seen, are people who have stayed close to their tribal people. And some people don't do that physically in a physical sense, but they've held the tribe close to them in their knowledge and in their way of thinking. And so I think I've seen a lot of unhappy people who have lost their way away from their tribal people, and a lot of very happy people who've kept the values. In our communities still, even with all the changes that have gone on in the more traditional Cherokee communities, the people that are most respected are people who help other people, not people who acquire great personal wealth or great personal success. And so I think that if you're looking for, some advice on how to be a happy, fulfilled person, when you get toward the end of your life and you look back and say, have I lived a good life? The people that, are most happy are those people who've stayed connected to and close to their tribal people.
My name is Peter, and I want to say thank you for being here. And you were a few minutes late, and I was getting kind of antsy, so I went up there and I made a statement regarding Leonard Peltier, who has been in prison for 30 years. And as we acknowledge that all things are connected, I've put forth many a time that his is the heaviest case in the world, and his incarceration and or freedom is in direct relation to our grandchildren. Now the great general strike has been called, and I say it is until this brother is released from prison. A peaceful, powerful general strike that joins the migrant workers on Monday. The question is, will you add your heart and your voice to this peaceful action?
I'm not familiar with the walkout or who's involved, but when we lived in the Bay Area, we were very supportive. We helped. John Trudell was the guy then who was helping with the Leonard Peltier trial, and there's not a thinking, reasonably intelligent person in the world who wouldn't agree that Leonard Peltier's trial was a gross miscarriage of justice. So whatever's happening on May 1st is probably a good thing, but I don't know any of the details of that, so I couldn't volunteer for it without knowing that.
Recently, I went on a road trip across the country and got to visit Sequoia's homestead. And it was so interesting. I wondered if everyone here knows about him, if you could tell people a little about Sequoia's role in the Cherokee literacy.
Sequoia was a very, 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 very significant, or is a very, very significant person in Cherokee life. He was a scholar who pretty much single-handedly developed the Cherokee syllabary, the Cherokee alphabet, and gave as a gift to Cherokee people and to the world the Cherokee written language, which has been used extensively over time. And so there are very few people in all the history of the world who were able to sit down and just with a single-minded focus develop a written language. And Sequoia basically observed the way the non-native people communicated with one another, and really was intrigued by that idea and decided to develop a system of writing for Cherokee people. And so we still see a lot of the written Cherokee language, though it's not used as much. My husband's mother could only read Cherokee. And when the boys were in the service, they would write to her in the Cherokee language. And but people of her generation were probably the last generation of Cherokee people who actually used the written language for, as a practical matter, and not as an academic exercise. It's a very important contribution that Sequoia made. I'm getting a little tired, so we'll take 2 more questions.
Not a question, Sister Mankiller, but a thank you for being here. I really appreciate you, and I was happy to meet you in Oregon at Salem at my grandnephew's graduation. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for being here. Sitting and listening to you, watching you, remind me a lot of my mother and my grandmother. And I like very much that picture where they take you show my family. They will see the resemblance, and I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you. That wasn't a real question, so I'll take that one.
I was wondering how much you use traditional Cherokee medicine versus other medicines like Western medicine.
I'm sorry?
How much you use traditional Cherokee medicine as opposed to Western medicine?
I've used traditional medicine a lot. And my husband's family is very involved. That has been for several generations used traditional medicine. I think the most important medicine is the one that I talked about, which is the medicine of the mind, because I don't have any control over what happens to me physically, but I have control over the way I think about it. And so I think that's been the most important way. But in terms of seeing medicine people and using traditional Cherokee medicine, I've used them a lot. I used to go see a traditional medicine person before going to an important meeting. I remember going to, when I was an employee of the Cherokee Nation, going to a medicine person to get some help before I went to the Indian Health Service to try to contract some services from the Indian Health Service. And it was interesting. I still remember that because he told me to hold this root in my mouth, and I was trying to talk and hold this root in my mouth at the same time. But it was me on one side and all the IHS people on the other side, and we contracted that program. And so over the course of the years. And then the other more personal story is that when I was in the car wreck, it was a very bad car wreck. My girlfriend was killed, and my leg was almost severed. And so the doctor, after about 6 weeks, released me from the hospital. I had casts on both legs, and I was in a wheelchair. And we had a very emotional meeting where he told me that he couldn't get the top part of my leg to connect to the bottom part in layman's terms. It's very technical language he used. So I went home. My mom picked me up, my sister picked me up in a van, and I went home. And we asked for a Cherokee medicine man to come. And so his name was Jim Wolf. He's now deceased. So he came. And he came to help me with my leg. And when I went back to the doctor for my x-rays, the top part and the bottom part were connected. And I wear a brace, but I've walked ever since then. So I've used medicine men. I don't have an explanation for that whatsoever. But all I know is that it happened. So it's played a very significant role in my life, and one of the reasons why we continue to live where we live. And I think that's a good note to close on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody here.
Okay. Ready? Okay.
You're going to be available in the back for pictures? Yeah, thank you all so very much. I'm really pleased and proud that Sonoma State University turned out for this event. Wilma will be available in the back for pictures for a short time, but don't press too hard, okay? Good night.